State your name for the record.
Pazuzu Algarad.
What does that mean? Does that ever mean?
It's a Lord's name.
What does Allah stand for?
Oh, that's good knowledge.
Walls marred with satanic symbols.
You're greeted with this smell of just ammonia and urea. It just smells like straight urine. Rotting matter greets you as soon as that door is opened.
Floors coated in filth, bugs, and feces.
Dude, your house smells like death.
Human beings would just pop a squat in a corner, take a crap, and God knows when it would get cleaned up, or the dogs might eat it, or whatever.
Doors printed in black ink with the ramblings of a madman.
When I saw their front door, I didn't want to be there. I wanted to leave immediately.
These are just small glimpses of the house of horrors that Pazuzu Algarad and his followers resided in the cozy bedroom community of Clemmons, North Carolina. But the depraved, inhumane things that truly took place inside this house are beyond comprehension.
He would eat the heart of it and then burn the flesh of the rabbit.
Were the horrific secrets held in the house and buried in the backyard the result of a man in Satan's grasp, or the unraveling psyche of a man who never had a chance?
Do you ever stop and think why the ground is so uneven out here?
Pazuzu Algarad wasn't always known as Pazuzu. In fact, for the majority of his life, up until he was 24 years old, he was an unremarkable, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid with a sad smile. Johnny Lawson. Those around him had no idea that he would one day become one of the most notoriously twisted killers of all time.
I despise the human race. People are ugly and pointless creatures. I sit back and watch them and they anger me. I should get a medal for murdering these stupid...
Johnny, as his childhood friends and family called him, was born August 12, 1978, on the foggy coast of California, just outside of San Francisco. His childhood is as much of a mystery as his mental state, mainly because he can't seem to keep his story straight himself. His followers would later claim that Pazuzu told him that he was raised in Iraq by a high priest, but really this was far, far from the truth.
Little Johnny was not right, and everybody knew it.
For years, they were a normal family.
Johnny was raised by a single mother when his parents divorced soon after he turned 8 years old. By then, he and his mother had moved to cozy, all-American Clemmons, North Carolina, just outside Winston-Salem. If you were to take a snapshot from the 50s of the perfect family, you'd find quite a few households to match Clemmons. In fact, people go to church every Sunday here, and the majority of households, a whopping 84%, are married couples with children. From the outside looking in, it seems as though it would be a perfect community to raise a child in, and for some, it may very well be. But for Johnny, things were challenging from the start. At a very young age, he looked like everyone else, dressing up in cowboy outfits, hat included, and playing outside with a smile on his face. But as time went on, things started to change.
Cynthia says she first noticed a change in her son when she remarried.
People who knew him as a child described him as a bit emotional and found him unusual compared to his peers.
When I met Johnny, he was weird. He wore this big cape, black cape with his teeth. Jason, Freddy Krueger, the vampire movie, he was all those people.
I assume I need no introduction.
His childhood babysitter told reporters that on more than one occasion, she felt Johnny was a melancholy child. He didn't quite fit in, and yet she considered him to be a funny, caring, and kind boy compared to his classmates. He loved horror movies and often wore a cape, running around and pretending to be a vampire for days on end. His babysitter alleges that Johnny had a reason to be melancholy. His father moved back to California, lessening his contact with Johnny and leaving his mother as a single parent. According to the babysitter, Johnny's mother Cynthia was involved in drugs and alcohol, and she often brought men in and out of Johnny's home and his life.
She drinks a lot for once, and she go with all these guys. I mean, she leave Johnny behind, and there she goes. Johnny see all that stuff, and, the little kid, get in his mind, like, why my mama do that?
it's clear that Johnny wasn't living the stable, happy life that kids thrive with. This would soon begin to take its toll and eventually lead to the disappearance of both pets as well as people in the local community.
When Johnny was probably 8 years old, Johnny was very abusive, of her. He hit her and stuff like that. So she put her in a mental hospital. And me and her went to see Johnny, and my heart broke because I said, that little boy, he didn't need to be there. The one that needs to be there is the woman, the mama.
At 13, Johnny completely cut contact with his father and would thereafter begin to experiment with drugs as well as alcohol, a blazing red flag indicating potential mental illness. Typically, those who are struggling with any type of mental disorder, from bipolar to eating disorders to depression, studies have found that these people are much more likely to experience substance abuse at a young age. And those who abuse substances are often clinging to them because they tend to alleviate emotions that they cannot quite understand, and not to mention they often serve as a perfect escape for them. These are the very emotions that would engulf Johnny for the rest of his life. He was ruthlessly teased and called Turd Boy, and while some kids may be cruel, they're not always clever. The name-calling deeply hurt Johnny all the same, and by 13, he was already vocally considering ending his life. But despite this, little was done to help. His mother claims that he was diagnosed with agoraphobia, schizophrenia, and psychosis, but that attending psychiatrist appointments and therapy was way too expensive for them to afford. This is a tragic reality that dominates the United States healthcare system, preventing people like Johnny who need help from getting it.
Overall spending on healthcare has doubled over the past 2 decades, reaching $8.5 trillion in 2019, which comes out to 9.8% of global GDP.
It's hard to imagine what may have become of Johnny if any intervention had taken place. Would police have still made a horrific discovery in Pazuzu's backyard in 2015? Or would things with said timely intervention have turned out wildly different? By 18, Johnny was still a freshman in high school, having been held back. He drank unashamedly at school, spoke of committing animal sacrifices, and hardly showered. Teachers turned a blind eye to him and were unsure of how to help him. At home, his mother had remarried, and neighbors claimed that they would often hear violent screaming matches where Johnny would bellow that he hated his stepfather. After finally dropping out of high school, things would begin going rapidly downhill for Johnny, and the relationship between him and his mother became even more complicated. In his early 20s, he demanded that his mother end her relationship with his stepfather, but instead, she would kick him out. But that rift in their relationship would be short-lived, and soon, Cynthia would move hell and earth for her son, even if it meant living in utter filth and hiding horrific, stomach-churning secrets.
I just stood there.
In 2002, John Lawson legally changed his name to Pazuzu Algarad. To many, the name Pazuzu brings up twisted, nightmare-inducing images of the possessed girl in The Exorcist, where a demon of the same name takes control of the main character, Regan. Pazuzu is the name of the ancient Babylonian demon who was in control of the underworld, and Johnny's decision to change his name to this didn't surprise many people who were close to him, and this was for more reasons than one. The second part of his name, Ila Algarad, means the Lord of Locusts, a fitting name for someone set on bringing destruction to the community around him.
You could tell when his demons needed something from him.
As soon as the name change occurred, both Pazuzu's beliefs and behaviors grew more and more extreme. He shaved his head and began to tattoo demonic symbols on himself. His body would become crisscrossed in lines that not only stood out to his community, but scared them. It was clear at this point to those closest to him that Pazuzu wanted to become everything that typical people in a small community feared.
Pazuzu had done everything he could to make himself seem scary to the people in town. He was trying to freak people out.
He began wearing a taqiyya, an Islamic head covering for men, and this was despite him not practicing Islam. It's also important to remember that this was in the rural South just after 9/11, when fear and prejudice against Muslim individuals were at an all-time high.
Muslims and people of Arab and South Asian descent in America also face racial profiling by law enforcement.
By combining Islamic cultural symbols and words with satanic imagery and beliefs, Pazuzu had around this time transformed himself into the antithesis of the community around him. And that choice certainly wasn't by accident. Pazuzu wanted to be seen, and it's possible that upon realizing that he wasn't seen as normal, he decided that he'd take his identity to the polar opposite of the spectrum.
Tattoos that had largely gone unseen to the public, some reading Pazuzu, Lucifer, Satan, Villain, 666, Joker, live fast and die.
While many of the wealthy, polished older people around him showed off bright pearly whites, Pazuzu bizarrely filed his teeth into sharp points. He had no idea that in a few years' time, he would burrow these same teeth into the arteries of his arm in an attempt to escape the fate awaiting him. Pazuzu lived at 2749 Nob Hill, a quaint house that hid more than one dark secret. Almost immediately, Pazuzu began to grow a strange following at his house. He invited people who were struggling with drug addiction, homelessness, as well as job loss, to gather at his home and do as they pleased.
Black metal blaring at ungodly, ear-shattering volumes. There was always glass getting smashed, people fighting.
In a society filled with young and disenfranchised people who were struggling in the aftermath of the 07-08 financial crisis, this place served as a beacon of hope and a much-needed sanctuary for them. But Pazuzu's house, dubbed the House of Horrors, is a kind of sanctuary, quote-unquote, that only people who were truly struggling could endure, or in fact see any sort of merit in stepping foot in.
Dude, your house smells like death. Oh yeah, it's just the bodies in the basement.
Long, ratty-ass dreadlocks, and all his teeth filed down to a point, which later come to find out he did high as hell on meth one day.
The home, if one could even refer to it as that, proved to be as lawless as it was filthy. People would regularly float in and out of the house, abusing substances, breaking furniture, getting in violent altercations, and also using the carpet and closets as a bathroom. By all accounts, the house reeked of urine and feces, and after people defecated on the carpets, it would often be days before it was taken care of. If it was taken care of at all.
Human beings would just pop a squat in a corner, take a crap, and God knows when it would get cleaned up, or the dogs might eat it, or whatever.
Shockingly, his mother lived in the same home, hiding in her own much cleaner quarters, at least in comparison to the rest of the house, seemingly able to disassociate from the horrors and filth taking place just outside her door and down the hall. In spite of the grime, there was a staggering number of young women who also flocked to Pazuzu's house. Many people suspect that Pazuzu targeted young women and subtly manipulated them over time, increasing his demands and control over them, much like Charles Manson would, who he also reportedly happened to be a big fan of. Orgies were supposedly commonplace, and one of Pazuzu's followers even claimed that they were casually shown footage of sexual acts taking place between several people at the home.
The video was of Pazuzu and Bubbles dancing around naked, Bubbles lying on a bed in one scene, doing inappropriate things to herself.
There was people naked like it was nothing. He tried to have orgies and trying to manipulate people into having sex and doing whatever they wanted to do.
You know, it's like this mad place where you can act out your darkest and sickest fantasies to no judgment.
Claiming to be the gatekeeper of hell, Pazuzu, in an attempt to prove it, went to extreme lengths. Every new moon, he would sacrifice an animal as part of a ritual, and followers claimed that Pazuzu would drink blood from birds that he'd killed, and also claimed that at one point during a sacrifice, early in his self-proclaimed rule as a demonic god, strung a cat from a tree. But how could a man who was clearly teething on the edge of insanity amass a following that supported his killing of innocent animals, drinking blood, and ruthlessly trashing his own house? People close to Pazuzu claim that he had some sort of magnetic allure about him.
The idea that you can go somewhere judgment-free with no pressure on you, somebody's gonna give you drugs and let you behave however you want, there's an appeal to that.
But that perceived magnetism may in hindsight simply come down to the most basic human needs and desires. Several people who joined Pazuzu were involved with drugs and had been rejected by their families. They had no place to eat, sleep, no one to talk to, and really no one to help them get the substances that they so desperately craved for an escape. They were outcasts who didn't belong in the tight-knit Christian town that they were raised in, and they had nowhere else to go and no one who wanted them. But Pazuzu did want them. In fact, he needed them for his own ego just as much as they needed him for shelter, support, and substances. Many of the people that he once again targeted were facing a bleak world fresh out of high school, and the idea of someone wanting them, especially a very popular and powerful man like Pazuzu, had an irresistible appeal for them. And this appeal and desperation is exactly why it took so long for Pazuzu's horrific crimes to come to light. And this was in spite of him openly bragging to his followers about the murders that he'd committed. July of 2009 was the last time that Stacy saw her ex-partner and father of her child, 37-year-old Joshua Wetzler. Despite the recession killing their romantic relationship, Joshua was still known as a loving father, and Stacy still cared for him deeply. She had no idea that a cookout near the ranch they'd both dreamt of owning together would be the very last time she would see his smile or hear his laugh.
Then when she got pregnant, they settled down, bought a small farm that they were going to turn into a horse farm, got screwed by a bank right before all the loan companies and everything start to fail, and Josh's life starts going downhill there.
Little is known about how exactly Josh knew Pazuzu or disappeared at his hands. At the time, Josh was allegedly selling substances to support him and his family, which may have been the only link between him and Pazuzu.
His wife leaves him because he got desperate and he started thinking about selling drugs. I mean, it was pretty benign stuff like weed and mushrooms, but his wife didn't want a child around that sort of thing. She had to leave.
Josh was a man who had been on the right side of the law for years of his life. But after him and Stacy lost their house and after he lost his job, he felt he had no choice but to sell substances to make a living. Soon after Josh disappeared from the face of the earth, Pazuzu drunkenly stood before his followers. He proudly told anyone who would listen that he had a man trapped in his basement and that they were not to let him out. Some followers claimed that Pazuzu tortured and starved the man in his basement for days before he killed him, and they also mentioned that he cut off all of his appendages. He bragged that he covered the body of the man in cat litter and bleach in order to cover up the stench, and bizarrely, despite all these gruesome details that he shared with them, he would give his followers no explanation of why he did this, nor did they even ask. All they did know was that he claimed to violently murder a man and that he was proudly wearing that man's blood-stained bandana around his head for days. That bandana belonged to Joshua Wetzler.
It was Josh's bandana, from what I was told by everyone that hung out with him. They had trapped him in a basement, and they'd starved him for days. They cut off his extremities, his arms and his legs and his penis, and they buried him in pieces.
On August 3rd, 2009, Tarina Billings, Pazuzu's neighbor, nervously made her way to the sheriff's office after a heartbreaking encounter. Several nights earlier, Pazuzu showed up to her house frantic and begged Tarina's father to come help him with something. When her father returned later under the cover of night, blanketed in dirt from head to toe, Tarina's heart sank. At a party in early August, Pazuzu had killed someone and buried him in his backyard, and laughed about it with no remorse.
It was very hard to go to the police, but I thought, what if that was my brother buried in somebody's backyard? I would want somebody to come forward and say something.
Tarina was undoubtedly brave to speak to the police, a hero even, which only made law enforcement's reaction that much more heartbreaking. Officers rushed Tarina out of the office, unconcerned, and nonchalantly telling her that they would follow up on her lead. Their follow-up consisted of reporting to Pazuzu's house, asking him if he had a body buried in the backyard, and then leaving after Pazuzu told him that he didn't. A month later, an anonymous caller contacted dispatch to report that a man had been shot and buried in Pazuzu's backyard. And bizarrely, once again, the police would not conduct a proper search. And the fact that it's possible that if a search had been conducted or pressure had been put on Pazuzu during this time, the next tragedy that was yet to occur would perhaps never have had a chance to happen, and that one more person would still be alive and with his family. It was October of 2009 when Tommy Dean Welch left his house for a walk. He was planning to get pizza and watch a movie with his mother later that night after his nieces and nephews fell asleep. But Tommy never returned home. Instantly, his family knew that something was deeply wrong. But little did they know just how wrong things truly were. Even in their states of anxiety, with their minds racing and their stomachs churning, they couldn't possibly imagine what really happened to Tommy. And this was primarily because to this day, it still doesn't make sense to anyone involved in the case. It's believed that during his walk to get pizza, Tommy encountered Pazuzu and his followers. And after that, he vanished, only to be found 5 years later in a place that no one would expect. Sylvia LaBelle, a Clemmons local, was not the type of person that you would expect to be involved with the twisted, horrific life of Pazuzu Algarad. And yet, she too found herself weakly intertwined with it, giving Pazuzu and his friends rides and occasionally sitting inside his house at parties. And at one of the aforementioned parties, she too was present when Pazuzu mentioned that he killed someone named Josh. Disturbed, she told this to one of her own friends on a drive home one night, completely unaware that her friend was also a close friend of Josh's ex, Stacy. Upon learning about who Josh was and how Stacy was mourning, Sylvia and Stacy's unnamed friend knew that they had to do something. Their hearts ached not just for the injustice that had been done, but also the suffering that they saw Stacy enduring. So they took matters into their own hands. Now, because of a previous charge, Sylvia didn't think that she would be taken seriously by police without evidence, and so she chose to step foot into the lion's den, if you will, in order to get the answers herself. Using a hidden recorder, she went to Pazuzu's house and asked his followers if Pazuzu had actually killed anyone. And bizarrely, the followers, while laughing, told her that he had, disclosing details about Josh's killing, unaware that they were on tape the whole time.
So we concocted the plan that I would get a voice recording of information on how Josh died or was murdered. I went with my phone to record any information I could. There were several people that spoke up on the voice recording, but the main voice was Nate. I started laughing and said, "Is it true that Pazuzu actually killed people?" And Nate looked at me and said, "Well, yeah, like it was common knowledge. He'd killed people."
With evidence finally in hand, Sylvia then went to the police with the recording. She felt that Pazuzu, as well as all the damage that he'd caused to the community of Clemmons, would finally be stopped and that they would be at last free from his terrifying, not to mention unsettling, rule. But despite the evidence presented, police didn't take her seriously.
I know I looked crazy, but they didn't take anything I said seriously.
To be quite frank, it's unknown why this is, but speculatively, it could potentially be because Sylvia's recording could be used in court against them. This is because the conversation was recorded without the other party's consent. Now, on the other hand, it could also be because law enforcement simply didn't believe Sylvia, or that they didn't want to investigate the satanic cult that they'd heard so many whispers and rumors about. With her tail between her legs at this point, Sylvia then went to the horse farm that Stacy was working on. There were beautiful rolling green hills that stretched into the horizon, and horses that trotted and rolled in the sunshine, unaware, of course, of the horrors that were swirling in Sylvia's mind. When Sylvia saw Josh's son running through the grass of the farm, her heart shattered. That little boy deserved answers about his father, and Stacy, who had worked so hard for answers, deserved justice.
So many emotions ran through my mind when I saw him, thinking, oh my God, his dad was murdered by this guy that I happen to know.
It was at this point that finally, Stacy would go to the police.
And I went to the police and I told him, I said, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I think my son's father is buried in, this guy's backyard in Clemmons.
With her clean record, police finally took Josh's disappearance and the claim that he was buried on Pazuzu's compound more seriously.
We executed a search warrant at 2749 Nob Hill Drive in Clemmons, North Carolina.
In February of 2010, after numerous calls, in-person visits, and even a confessional recording, law enforcement finally searched Pazuzu's property. What did they find? Nothing. Reportedly, law enforcement did not have the ground-penetrating radar necessary to locate a buried body, and not to mention cadaver dogs didn't hit on the house. Pazuzu and his followers remained free, though of course neither he, or as a matter of fact them, were free of guilt.
I really did not know what to think because I was so sure that Josh was there in Pazuzu's yard. when they didn't find him, I wasn't sure anymore what had happened.
A few months later, yet another murder would take place. 30-year-old Joseph Chandler was coerced to join Pazuzu and one of his followers, 20-year-old Nicholas Rizzi, in their car. They arrived at a local park and found themselves standing at the edge of the lake. What happened there is still a mystery to this day, but a few shocking facts are known. Nicholas pulled a gun and raised it behind Joseph's head. After it failed to fire, he hurried to the car where he would retrieve yet another gun. Unaware of what was about to happen, Joseph then lit a cigarette and gazed out over the moon-soaked lake, and before he could take a drag, he was shot in the head.
30-year-old Joseph Emmerich Chandler was found shot dead by the Yadkin River. Pazuzu, then 31, was charged with accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter, with Yadkin County deputies claiming Pazuzu had assisted Nicholas Rizzi, who was charged with involuntary manslaughter in connection, in his attempt to escape arrest.
Nicholas was quickly linked to the crime. After claiming that he shot Joseph in self-defense, he'd be jailed for 13 months for involuntary manslaughter. Pazuzu, on the other hand, was only charged as an accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter and received nothing but probation for his actions. Leading up to the trial, Pazuzu would be forced to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and it was during this evaluation that Pazuzu would reveal extremely dark and disturbing details about himself. He said that he only bathed about once a year, and this was because he believed that his stench and filth protected him against disease. And after attempting to dive deep into his religious beliefs to see if there were any delusions involved, he would then reveal to authorities that he practiced a Sumerian religion that he made up himself.
Pazuzu. He claimed to be able to control the weather. He became Winston-Salem's own masculinist icon of depravity.
He claimed that he learned the rites and beliefs while going through a 5-year shamanistic journey. After stating this, he'd then anxiously tell medical staff that he had to leave to perform a ritual under the black moon, as he did every month. When the staff spoke to Pazuzu's mother, she bizarrely echoed his concerns, shamelessly telling the medical professionals that her son's ritual involved killing a small animal, and that if he didn't go through with the plan, she feared he may end his own life. Despite the insanity of Pazuzu's psychiatric evaluation, his diagnosis was rather simple: panic disorder with agoraphobia, alcohol dependence, and possible schizotypal personality disorder.
Psychiatrist Dr. Phil Levine says Pazuzu's schizotypal personality disorder would have led him to experience unusual perceptual experiences, odd thinking or speech to be suspicious.
He had alcohol problems for a long time, and then he started getting into methamphetamines, which is not likely to help him, but to make his anxiety issues worse.
Adding he wouldn't have responded well to medications.
Schizotypal personality disorder involves magical thinking, strange beliefs, detachment from reality, and trouble in social relationships. But it does not involve hallucinations or delusions. Both conditions, however, can involve a break from reality. But the difference is that schizophrenia is marked by a prolonged disconnection from reality that takes place over at least a month-long period and makes it extremely challenging for those with the disorder to function or speak with others. In Pazuzu's case, he was able to interact cooperatively with the law system as well as with the people at the mental health facility where he was held. Still, he displayed symptoms of odd beliefs, paranoia, as well as strange speech patterns, all of which are hallmarks of schizotypal personality disorder. After his brush with incarceration, things began to spiral for Pazuzu. Perhaps it was the pressure of the pending charges against him, or maybe it was his fear of the truth being found out. But despite these fears of his, the violence on Nob Hill escalated. In May of 2010, Pazuzu would be arrested for choking his mother Cynthia until she couldn't breathe. Later, Cynthia redacted the charges, unwilling to pursue a lawsuit against her own son. It wasn't until 2014 that the law would finally look in Pazuzu's direction again. By then, he had grown his following and found himself in a polyamorous relationship with not just one, but 3 young girls who he called his fiancées, all of whom were under the age of 25. These women, Dixie, Amber Birch, and Crystal Matlock, had not only witnessed Pazuzu do horrible things, but some of them had even helped him cover it up. In mid-2014, Matt Flowers found himself standing in the filthy den that Pazuzu and his followers called home. Matt, a war veteran having just returned from the Middle East a few months earlier, reported in interviews that he holds himself to a moral code, like many people in the military do. He claimed that Pazuzu, however, had no morals.
Pazuzu, I just felt like he wasn't going anywhere. He's just kind of a shitbag, you know. He just like, Pazuzu would call me all the time on the phone. And he wanted to know if I killed anyone in Iraq. I've seen what the world really is like. Nobody's right or wrong in a war. Nobody's good or evil in war. But Pazuzu, he was highly evil.
After assaulting 2 of Matt's female friends, including one that was a veteran herself, Matt became disgusted with Pazuzu and eager to get him behind bars. At a party on one fateful night, Pazuzu berated his mother in front of his guests, threatening her, screaming at her, and calling her horrific names. One of the guests, who remains unnamed, went on to tell Pazuzu off for speaking to his mother in such a tone. In response to this, Pazuzu then pulled Matt into another room and tried to coerce him into murdering the man who had just spoken out against him.
It's like, let's kill him right now. We'll get away with it.
Many reports indicate that Pazuzu rarely did his own dirty work. After all, that's what his followers were for, at least in his eyes. However, Matt was no follower. Instead, after Pazuzu's coercion attempts, he marched to the police station and reported what Pazuzu said to him. And because of the fact that he'd served in the army, he was one of the few people that had come forward who was taken seriously by the police. It was on August 5, 2004 that Forsyth County Sheriff's Office conducted their second search of Pazuzu's property. That being said, this was in fact their first thorough search, and what they found inside was startling. The stench was unbearable. Feral animals ran amok. Satanic sketches were etched into the walls, the pool, the doors, and even the exterior of the house. One room, known as the altar room, was such a biohazard that the fire department had to wear hazmat suits in the room just to search it. And shockingly, it wasn't what officers could see that was the most disturbing part of all this, but in fact what lay beneath their feet. It was beneath the fire pit that law enforcement discovered a body in a shallow grave. The body had seemingly been cut apart and left as nothing but a mound of skeleton, decaying flesh, and ripped clothing. And on the corner of the lot, they discovered another.
The Forsyth County Sheriff's Office announced they'd found the skeletal remains of 2 people in Algarad's backyard.
This is actually where one was buried.
Now, they'd found not just one body, but 2. All the warnings they'd gotten throughout the years, all the calls, all the emails, all the in-person visits, all of them were true. Pazuzu had in fact killed and buried people in his backyard. Pazuzu and his girlfriends Amber Birch and Crystal Matlock were arrested, and soon after, the home was deemed uninhabitable and would be brought to the ground, during which time neighbors celebrated the destruction of the devil's house they'd all come to fear. It wasn't long after their discovery that the bodies would be identified as those of Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Dean Welch, both of whom had gunshot wounds to the head as well as their torsos.
I knew immediately it was Josh. Just such relief. I mean, tears of joy. I just felt like he was out of there. You know, he was free.
In the aftermath of the arrest, little of the truth was revealed, but some shocking details would come to light. Pazuzu had ruthlessly shot Joshua Wetzler in July of 2009. Amber and Crystal were his accomplices in burying the body. In October, Birch was coerced into shooting Tommy Welsh in the back of the head while he sat on Pazuzu's couch. Pazuzu then helped her bury the body.
So I started dating this girl, Dixie. She was intrigued with him and his girlfriend, Amber, and we started going over to his house to hang out. She walked out onto their back porch with me one night and pointed out the backyard. She was like, "Do you ever stop and think why the ground is so uneven out here?"
Meanwhile, Pazuzu's mom, Cynthia, who was present for all the murders, was never charged with any crimes.
Just feet outside the basement, where Algarad's mother, Cynthia James, says Pazuzu had stashed Josh's body.
I heard this pop, 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 pop come out of my room. And I said, "What's going on?" And Josh is laying on the floor, and I'm like, "My God, I don't remember what, I'm going crazy."
She asked him to come sit in the den before returning to her bedroom, where she considered her options and chose to do nothing.
So then I came out and I said, "I'm gonna go to work."
Joshua and Tommy had families. They had lives. And for no logical reason, those lives were snatched from them and those who loved them. Crystal was charged with accessory after the fact for first-degree murder for helping bury Wetzler. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit accessory after the fact to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 3 years and 10 months in prison. In May 2018, she was released. And Amber, who took a plea deal pleading guilty to second-degree murder and accessory after the fact to murder and robbery with a dangerous weapon, was sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison, which she's currently still serving. But bizarrely, Pazuzu was never sentenced. While being held in prison, he reportedly used his sharp teeth to bite into an artery and take his own life, and he would thereby be pronounced dead on October 28, 2015, never forced to face the penalties for his brutal crimes. Although this case is a tragic one, fortunately some bright spots have arisen in the sea of darkness and turmoil that Pazuzu created. Joshua Wetzler's ex, Stacy Carter, owns and operates Heart-Centered Horsemanship, an equine training and therapy facility to help people struggling with mental health, addiction, and other issues. Until this day, she carries her love for Josh and their combined love of horses and farming with her everywhere she goes.
My life's work has become about horses and teaching people, giving people that opportunity.
Pazuzu's story and the story of Joshua and Tommy didn't have to end this way. Pazuzu once again displayed extreme social anxiety and agoraphobia as a child. With a lack of intervention due to cost, he never really had a chance to correct those mental health problems welling inside of him. No one in the community reached out to help him, and instead, they ostracized him even further. This is a chronic issue in American society, one that can only be fixed with resources and proper education. In addition, it's also important to once again note that those who flocked to Pazuzu were ostracized as well, and police didn't take them seriously regardless of the multiple tips they had given, which of course led to more people needlessly suffering and dying. This is why mental health intervention should be a priority and not an afterthought. There are no quote-unquote others in our society. There are just people who have either been misled, set aside, and/or are deeply, deeply troubled. The good news is, there are still things that we can do to improve our society, but in order to do so, we must be willing to not only look into the dark, but also confront what hides within it.